David Pearce, welcome to the 83rd episode of NEOHUMAN podcast.
Delighted to be with you. Thank you, Eka.
Yeah, awesome having you. How are you doing with pandemic and all that?
Well, I'm pretty sure. I'm 99% sure. I back in March, I had COVID. It was only very mild, but I haven't had an antibody test. But yes, it's disconcerting. I mean, I think it's taken a toll on a lot of people's mental health too. Yeah.
And you're in England, right?
Yeah, I'm in Brighton. I have what estate agents call an oblique sea view. If I stand on one leg by the window, I can see the sea.
It's a tragedy what is happening, I think, around the world. But at the same time, it's a wake-up call with respect to a lot of shortcomings and flaws of our civilization, it looks like. That even because the argument used to be like, maybe humanity can come together if there was some kind of an alien force. Well, this is it.
Yes, I said what I would most like, perhaps, is that we use the lesson of COVID to change our treatment of non-human animals. I mean, if we all became vegan, you don't hear of any vegan pandemics, but maybe that's too optimistic. Whether the right lessons will be drawn, I don't know.
Before going any further, let's talk a little about your background, the work you've done, the lives you've lived. What are you mainly focused on now these days?
Good heavens. Yeah, well, I'm a transhumanist. Transhumanists simplistically believe in the creation of a triple S civilization of super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness. My own background, though I'm not personally religious, I come from quite a religious family, vegetarian on both sides of the family. 3 of my 8 great-grandparents were vegetarian, all 4 grandparents, both parents, and so forth. Yeah, from an early age, preoccupied by the problem of suffering and how to get rid of it. Unsatisfied with religious solutions, so therefore drawn to science. And yeah, in my late teens and 20s, sketched out what I would now call the Abolitionist project. This is the idea it's going to be possible to use genetic engineering to recalibrate the hedonic treadmill and replace the biology of pain and suffering with a biology of life based on gradients of intelligent bliss. And I think it's important to stress the universalist aspect, and that insofar as biotechnology promises a world not just in which humans don't suffer, but a living world in which non-human animals can flourish too.
Right off the bat, one of the arguments against transhumanism, even though there isn't any kind of a unified definition of transhumanism accepted by even transhumanists right now in the world, right?
Yes, I mean, I sometimes cite the Transhumanist Declaration of 1998, reaffirmed in 2009. And yeah, that the well-being of all sentience, of the 8 articles, well-being of all sentience is number 7. I would put it number 1. Probably most transhumanists are going to be focused on one of the 3 supers, but most particularly the super intelligence or super longevity. Only a minority are particularly focused on the problem of suffering.
How would you define suffering? It's a very Buddhist concept in a context of religions, because my understanding is I grew up as a Muslim in Iran, not by my choice, but also in Christianity, I noticed that suffering often is used by the God to punish and make a point against the disbelievers. But it's the Buddhism perspective towards suffering that differentiated. Well, that was the path of enlightenment, excuse me, path of enlightenment for Buddha himself, right?
Yes, I mean, one needs to be careful in the sense of not that much is really known precisely about the historical Buddha. But yeah, I quote statements attributed to the Buddha. May all that have life be delivered from suffering. I teach one thing, suffering and the end of suffering. And sure, the actual the idea or aspiration to get rid of suffering isn't novel. What has changed is the actual tools to make it feasible.
Yeah, the reason that I made the religious, I guess the point within the religious context is because just like transhumanism does not have a unified kind of a definition, suffering and dealing with suffering itself does not have a unified kind of an understanding among all of humanity to, first of all, these actions or these realities is what constitutes suffering, and second, that we need to get rid of them because there are governments around the world, there are cultures around the world who use punishment and suffering against others as a mean to protect their, I guess they believe, their land, their dignity, their culture, and their political advantage.
Yes, I mean, in terms of the actual definition of suffering, crudely, if one catches one's hand in the door and one is agony, that is suffering. Now, whereas a pinprick, one probably wouldn't call it suffering. And yeah, at what point either physical or mental pain becomes sufficiently severe that it's worthy of the name suffering, it's not in that sense well defined, and I'm not convinced it's even that important. What is pretty well defined is the kind of natural hedonic watershed of emotionally neutral experience zero, such that above this zero, states are generically pleasant, and below it, states are generically unpleasant. And there are lots of complications, I mean, mixed states that are partially pleasant, partially unpleasant. But if one is prepared to contemplate using biotechnology, it should be possible to create life based entirely on gradients of intelligent bliss.
One of the arguments then would be, how are we going to foresee the kind of consequences that will be made in the world that is not dominated but influenced by biotechnology, the intention of which is coming from quote unquote man and not quote unquote God?
Well, one of the advantages of stressing hedonic recalibration and creating life based on gradients of intelligent bliss is that it doesn't involve my imposing my values on you. If you wake up tomorrow morning in an extremely good mood and throughout the course of the day your life is animated by gradients of well-being, it's not a case of the imposition of one person or group's values on another. By itself, it's preference neutral. And this is one of the many reasons, even though it's a bit of a mouthful talking about recalibrating the hedonic treadmill, creating life based on information-sensitive gradients of bliss, then it's one way of getting around the irreconcilable conflicts that exist in the world, conflicting preferences. There is simply no logical way to reconcile the conflicting prejudices of religious and secular believers worldwide. However, there is a way, hedonic uplift, to ensure that everyone's default quality of life is extremely high.
The hedonic uplift that you're talking about can be guaranteed only on a decentralized basis, right? Not centralized or dependency on any kind of a centralized structure of authority, whether it's a corporation or a government or agency or anything like that.
Yeah, I suppose I need to really spell out, precisely what is involved here. Presumably, I'm thinking whether to go off onto a long spiel about politics. Although transhumanists hold some pretty radical ideas, I don't think anyone has come up with a better alternative to democracy. I mean, I needn't go on about the pitfalls of democracy, but everything else seems to be worse. So for the foreseeable future, we are going to need government. I think some decisions can only be taken on a worldwide basis. And as I would see it, the World Health Organization enshrined in its charter this definition of health as complete physical, mental, social well-being. If we are to have a world in which all sentient beings can flourish, of hedonic uplift, recalibrating the hedonic treadmill, there needs to be central governance of some kind. But in terms of how it's going to take place at the individual level, I would imagine it's going to be a case of, for a start, prospective parents being given access to pre-implantation genetic screening, counseling, option of CRISPR genome editing, so they can choose the genetic makeup of their future children. And probably this is most likely to happen initially in the case of well-defined genetic diseases. I mean, no one who has cystic fibrosis wants a child with cystic fibrosis, but I would hope and very strongly advocate that prospective parents choose the pain thresholds and hedonic set points of their future children. And if this reproductive revolution unfolds, we can foresee extremely strong selection pressure in favor of life based on gradients of intelligent well-being. But the political details are elusive. I mean, I might say I wish we could have a 100-year plan to abolish suffering throughout the living world. It's not going to happen. It's not politically realistic on that timescale, but it's technically feasible. This is what's so exciting about new technologies of genetic engineering, synthetic gene drives, and so forth.
But not also elusive. It's also very. I see the term transhumanism to inevitably become very politically divisive in the coming years, because the effect of technology on our lives on every scale, it's just accelerating. We're not going to go back. And then the question will become, hey, my First Amendment, or the other question with respect to Second Amendment, for example, that now guns are informations that they can be 3D printed, basically. At some point, people will be able to do that. So all of this will start meshing with each other and become very, I think, even further tribalized our societies, because some people will be like, oh, this is the way to go. And some people will be like, I don't want to have anything to do with it. This is a mark of a beast, or whatever that they want to use against it. So it just seems like, especially because you're suggesting that some kind of a centralized narrative is required to drive basically and direct this evolution. The intention to make some kind of a narrative into a status quo off the bat is very divisive, it seems like, especially now that people have instruments to be heard. You just go on Twitter and like, I don't like it because they're taking over our lives, and millions of people would agree with it immediately. It doesn't even matter what kind of reasoning and rationality is behind it.
Yes, I mean, just as the sort of marks of civilization has been the monopoly of the use of force of the nation state, I think in the long run we want the rule of law at the international level. We have it very, very imperfectly in the form of the United Nations, but some decisions can only be really taken at the global level, just as other decisions are best taken at the local or the national level. Getting the balance right is of course desperately difficult. But although, I mean, most of us can make cheap jokes about lawyers, but nonetheless, I think we should uphold the rule of law, that it is essential to civilization.
So the technological advancement will continue to be something on top of already existing laws, basically.
I mean, something like, okay, I mentioned the three supers of transhumanism: radical life extension, super longevity. When, you know, a truly radical breakthrough occurs, whether a form of gene therapy or a novel drug, in one sense, I'm a technological determinist. I think once the knowledge is there, essentially, not literally everyone, but almost everyone will want to use it and demand it, and governments will respond. And though in theory a patent holder might try to enforce its patents, in practice people worldwide, governments worldwide wouldn't stand for it. And in that sense, once the information is known, I suspect the benefits will be widely spread. The nature of a world in which people don't die of old age is very hard to envisage. One pitfall is that it's hard to see how we can have procreative freedom as we understand it in the world today if we have a world in which people don't age and their pets don't age. But this is a world, optimistically, sort of second half of this century, may not be to next century and beyond, because if anyone alive today who wants to see a glorious transhuman future might be well advised to sign up for cryonics, because although there may be revolutionary breakthroughs in the next decade or two, one simply can't know.
There's a cryonic company in Europe as well. I know about Alcor here.
Yes, I mean there's branches. Personally,
branches of
I
Alcor.
would intend to. I think you can sign up. I mean, I'm torn. You see, if I would anticipate being cryothanase, because I think yes, you're much more likely to be easily reanimated if you are suspended in optimal conditions than if it's done 6 hours later. I'm not convinced grandchildren or post-human superintelligence will judge it ethical to reanimate brain-damaged, dysfunctional savages from the previous era. I have a very dark conception of Darwinian life, but I would feel a hypocrite if I were preaching radical anti-aging, cryonics as a way to defang death if I didn't practice what I preach.
Mm-hmm. Aubrey de Grey on Joe Rogan, he was saying that some kind of a fundamental breakthrough is coming. I believe he was saying between the next 5 to 8 years or 6 to 8 years or something like that, that the difference between us living, let's say, up to 100 years will be with us living up to 100 years and living up to 300, 400 years. And it will happen overnight and it will change everything. And he said the single thing that he's most terrified of is that our politicians and our laws are not ready for that change. It's not that even they're not ready. They're not even acknowledging it.
I'm actually more troubled by the scientific obstacles in that if you ask some people, they say they wouldn't want to live forever, and yet one knows that an anti-wrinkle cream appears and it's swept off the shelves. In practice, maximum lifespan is not increasing, it's plateaued, and it really is going to take revolutionary medical breakthroughs. I think the hardest obstacle may well turn out to be the brain, that individual organs can be replaced. One can even have a whole body transplant. But the basis of aging in the CNS is very poorly understood. I mean, there are other routes to quasi-immortality that some transhumanists canvass, like sort of mind uploading. I'm very skeptical about that. I don't think classical computers can solve the binding problem. So I don't think there are going to be artificial neurons. But who knows? It's the very nature of revolutionary breakthroughs is that that they can't be anticipated. But one can't, if one looks at maximum life expectancy, point to any exponential or even linear growth there. Essentially, it's flat.
So you're not as optimistic.
I'm not as optimistic. Having said that, I should identify a possible source of confounding bias. I'm one of life's uber pessimists. I'm pessimistic about most things.
That's healthy. That's healthy.
Well, it's defensive pessimism. I mean, yeah, I'm aware of a certain incongruity of someone who describes themselves as a pessimist who thinks we're heading for gradients of super intelligent bliss. But yeah, I think of all manner of speed bumps on the way, and yeah, COVID is just a foretaste, I feel. But but having said that, I would stress Aubrey is the expert there, so kudos to Aubrey and what he's achieved.
Yeah, absolutely. Neuralink is something that supposedly is a candidate to solve a lot of brain-related obstacles and problems. Are you not optimistic about that either?
Yeah, well, in one sense, yes. I mean, but there's a bit of a paradox here. Ever since the discovery of what were then known as back in the 20th century as the pleasure centers, Olds and Milners, I mean, neuroscientists have known it is possible to induce perpetual well-being via electrode stimulation. Now, actually, it's not directly the pleasure centers that have been stimulated, it's the desire centers. But if one isn't worried about intelligent bliss, but simply keeping everyone happy, then it's possible to do so with some version of wireheading. What I think Neuralink and its successors would aim to do is to have a kind of sophisticated interface in which it would be possible to cure pain, depression, and enjoy life based on gradients of intelligent well-being. And I think it quite likely that essentially either our elderly selves or our successors will have access to, crudely speaking, superintelligence on a chip, that rather than thinking of post-human superintelligence as this alien entity, or the so-called intelligence explosion, then all the benefits of machine intelligence can actually be incorporated within you in a neurochip. But yeah, formidable obstacles to overcome. Essentially, we do not understand the brain. Now, in order to get rid of pain, suffering, and depression, it may not be necessary in a deep sense to understand the brain. One merely needs to understand the necessary and sufficient conditions for pain, anxiety, and so forth. But neuroscience hasn't got any idea how to solve the phenomenal binding problem. Why are you right now a unified subject of experience, perceiving perceptual objects rather than just 86 billion pixels of decoherent mind dust? Neuroscience doesn't know how to solve the hard problem of causal efficacy. How is it that consciousness has the causal power to inspire discussions of its own existence? So, there's also a lot of hype and marketing around Neuralink too. There are formidable technical and conceptual obstacles ahead.
It just seems like a scientist who's supposed to wonder about all of these things that you're talking about and come up with what we don't know. They're the people who have the hardest time saying that they don't know. Everything should be, we know it. This is how it is. And, don't you dare talk anything against it. But we don't really know much about anything. What is it that 98% of the DNA, they're calling it junk DNA just because we don't understand it?
Yeah, well, yes, it's shocking in one sense how little science knows. Science doesn't understand why anything exists at all. Science doesn't understand why consciousness exists, and given that all one ever directly has access to is one's own consciousness, this is a bit empirically disappointing. Yeah, in one sense, science obviously tremendously powerful as civilization depends upon it, but nonetheless, important areas are essentially just unknown. And something like consciousness, you can't really quarantine it from the rest of everything else. It's a deep mystery.
I mean, how can we even begin to understand consciousness when, for example, psychedelic drugs have been hard banned for the past how many years? 50 years, 60 years? And it's like something that once you've done it, there is no way to go back and look at life knowing that such a thing has existed, right? So how are we going to study these kind of things when the stupid, again, I'm going back to laws and lawmakers that are themselves seems to be obstacles on the ways of our understanding of who we are before we can transcend it?
Yes, I mean, something like drug law. I mean, to take the devil's advocate's case, no one can know in advance what they're letting themselves in for when they take a psychedelic. They may think they're capable of informed choice,
Yeah.
but they're not. Now, I don't think psychedelic drugs should be criminalized. I think people should be able to make their own choices, but I don't actually personally advocate people exploring them because Darwinian minds are so dark, and people can have hellish as well as heavenly and enlightening experiences. But when we have actually mastered our reward circuitry and can engineer life based on gradients of bliss, rather than being the end of knowledge, as some people claim, world of super happiness, everyone blissed out. Not that at all. I think we're going to be able to explore psychedelia, but we're still living in this kind of pre-Galilean era in which the experimental method is essentially prescribed. It's taboo. And it's quite possible that transhumans and posthumans will look at us with our knowledge in something analogous to the way that we would regard kind of scholastic theologians and so on. But we've got the kind of the symbols that we shuffle around, but entire state spaces of consciousness are just completely alien to us. Now, any of your listeners who are experienced with psychedelics will know what I mean when I say alien state spaces of consciousness, but anyone who is drug naive probably won't be very impressed, I fear.
Well, I will be on the front of that line of people who have experience with psychedelics. And on me, it had certainly a positive effect after going through a long tunnel of darkness and pain. But I realized that those elements, those undesired elements, were exactly what I had to deal with in order to be at peace with them and relieve myself of them, to find the light, to find the peace, to find the centeredness of my being, who I am beyond all these labels that are being placed on, a 5-second-old child. In my case, immediately I was a Shia Muslim straight male Iranian. And then the rest of your life is defined on that basis. So yeah, for me, it was positive. And, this is like 10 years ago, I started doing it. And, but just like you, I don't endorse it because I don't know where people are mentally. It can be good, it can be bad. But the bad of it, to me, by my experience, are the necessary things that you have to go through to understand about yourself. There are things that there are nuts that once they're open, then you're eventually liberated.
Psychedelic, yes. I mean, some good sense there. But psychedelics, they tend to be extremely unpredictable. I mean, this is it. And I mean, this shouldn't be surprising. Therefore, no amount of preparing someone for what they may or may not undergo is actually going to do justice to the nature of the experience.
They have to take a low amount. You start very low and then you add on top of it, because you can always add. But once you hit the kind of dose that you're not prepared for it, like I had experience a year ago, we met with a gentleman to experience Bufo. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
I mean, only in the abstract sense. I've
right.
never actually tried it. So yeah.
So it's one species out of 7,000 plus amphibian species that produces this venom, I guess, that they dry it and you can smoke it, and it has 5-MeO-DMT. So I smoked a certain amount, high dose, and I had a unbelievable experience, and I was at peace from the outside view, because I couldn't, I was gone. I was not in my body. But then the person after me, he got a little too arrogant, and he asked for even a higher dose, and he had a terrible time. And he was visibly in discomfort, as we could see him. But he wouldn't know it because, again, he's gone. But so, yeah, I think the idea that, hey, I get it, I got it, it'll be under control, I know what's coming, just give me as much as you can, then you'll get your ass kicked, because it's no place for that. Even that itself, I think, is a lesson that you can learn about yourself. That's why I don't see it. It's very unlikely that somebody dies as a result of a high dosage of, let's say, psilocybin mushroom, for example, or even like DMT. It doesn't matter how much you smoke, you're not going to overdose. But yeah, it can be really, really difficult, but there can also be lessons, unless there is some kind of an underlying mental problem, right? Which you got to be careful of that too.
Yeah, and as you get to know people better, most people have mental problems.
Yeah, some known, some unknown.
Well, indeed, yes. No, just rather unkindly, I tend to say that just a few people just don't have the imagination to have a really bad trip, but yeah, other people just should not do it. And yeah, so I'm very skeptical about claims of enlightenment. I mean, the analogy I sometimes give is that of a tribe of congenitally blind rationalists, and two members of the tribe stumble across a drug that induces what we would call visual experiences, but they don't have any conceptual equipment to describe visual experiences. They don't grow eyes or anything like that, and in consequence, when they try to start talking about what they're going through, they babble. It's just not within their conceptual scheme, and you can't blame the straight drug naive rationalists of the tribe for thinking, well, they're just babbling nonsense. And yet we can say that the tribespeople who actually try this strange, weird drug that induces visual experiences, they have stumbled on something profound, but yeah, they don't really understand or grasp what they've stumbled upon. And yeah, I think there are millions, billions, trillions, I don't know, of possible state spaces of consciousness that is far more different than let's say dreaming and waking consciousness, that transhumans, posthumans will explore in future. We haven't got concepts or language for what we lack. But however intellectually fascinating this is, I don't think it's morally urgent in the same way as the problem of suffering. I mean, I don't like thinking about suffering any more than anyone else. But that is, yeah, I mean, that is what I think one should be focusing on. It's a dark, yeah, it's a rather kind of dark note, because yeah, well, it's much more fun to talk about intellectually interesting, stimulating ideas, but yeah, suffering-focused ethics is, yeah, I mean that is my overriding priority, I would say.
Yeah, but going back, there is no common understanding or agreement on it globally, even with ethics and morality.
This is true, but I mean, this is all sentient beings have a pleasure-pain axis, and all sentient beings don't like being at one end of it, i.e., states of agony and despair. And yeah, though the fact that one doesn't want to be in agony and despair oneself doesn't then straightforwardly follow that no one should be. I'm moderately optimistic, at least, that it should be possible to win over consensus towards getting rid, first of all, yes, of the nastier forms of pain and depression, but eventually just to kind of ratchet up hedonic set points, hedonic range worldwide. But yeah, that will take a biological genetic revolution. It will also take a social political revolution too.
And philosophical.
Yeah, insofar as many people have learned to kind of rationalize, to a greater or lesser extent, suffering, yes. It's, I mean, although in some sense we can envisage a world without suffering, I mean, that is the traditional version of heaven in its different, or paradise in its different guises. Nonetheless, the idea of a civilization on Earth in which there was no experience below hedonic zero and everyone is blissfully happy, a lot of people struggle with this conceptually, philosophically, because yeah, most people in the course of a lifetime will, some periods at least, suffer a great deal, and one wants to, in a sense, rationalize it. And yeah, if someone comes along and says, well, look, hey, suffering, it's technically optional if we're prepared to upgrade our reward circuitry or tweak our DNA, a lot of people are rather ambivalent about it, shall we say.
Yeah, the interesting side of this to me is that how different, for example, certain societies function than others, because of, if we consider culture as an operating system, it is very acceptable for a tribe in Pakistan or Afghanistan to kill their daughter because the daughter has dishonored them. It's very unnatural to them not to do it. And that is their ethics and morality, and they have absolutely no intention of changing it. But even worse than that, for someone else from outside of their culture to come and tell them, hey, what you're doing is wrong. You shouldn't be doing that. So it seems like a fundamental kind of a disconnect within the humanity itself at this point. And this is something that I compare to the alignment problem in artificial intelligence field, that we don't have any kind of a unified objective that we have agreed upon. So I think that is the biggest disconnect, because it is that objective that will determine the steps towards that objective. If they're fundamentally different with each other, then the paths are going to be fundamentally different. And by the way, with enlightenment, I totally agree with you. I do not believe in a singular point of enlightenment that can be marketed and like, this is what you're going to get. There are a number of paths and versions and expressions of enlightenment to the number of people who are experiencing it. And I think that's the fact that it's fundamentally unknown and will remain unknown is the most intriguing part about it.
Yes, I mean, fortunately, none of the world's religions have any kind of prohibition against upgrading our reward circuitry or using pre-implantation genetic screening and counseling. If it had been around 2,000 years ago, possibly they would, but they don't. So this would be grounds for optimism. But I mean, this could be simply my secular utilitarian values speaking. But no, I mean, if we're talking to an Islamic audience, for example, rather than engage in sort of theological dispute or anything, I would just, it's, Allah the all merciful and all compassionate. And if secular rationalists can envisage a world in which all sentient beings can flourish, then I would find it hard to imagine, kind of almost for Allah wanting us not to use these tools. Now, as I said, obviously I'm not an Islamic scholar, but infinite love and compassion, whether it's the Christian version of God or Islamic conception of God, seems to be a constant. And in terms of a Christian audience, for example, I perhaps talk about the peaceable kingdom of Isaiah and a non-violent living world in which the lion and the wolf lie down with the lamb. I mean, there are anticipations of this vision, but possibly in that sense, I don't know. Possibly this is too optimistic. But most of the world's ethical, religious traditions place some weight, in many cases a great deal of weight, on reducing or preventing suffering and hardship. And that we share in common.
There are religions who are more, I would say, more flexible or more prepared to endorse transhumanism, Mormonism being one of them. Right? So there is a Mormon Transhumanist Association, for example, that is not very well seen by a lot of people within the Mormon community who are more fundamentalist and more conservative, I think. But they have the religious reasoning and religious justification for transhumanism. So maybe that would be a upgrade of certain religions.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to be invited to address Mormon Transhumanist Association virtually earlier this year. I was going to actually fly over there to talk to them. In religious terms, I mean, all of the kind of religions of the Indian subcontinent have this notion of ahimsa and harmlessness, and another thing one can stress too, I think, is that although a lot of scientific rationalists assume that the future is secular, as we actually understand, in some sense, the molecular basis of spiritual, religious, divine experience in the brain, it would be possible to enrich, amplify, purify that experience. And now what this experience means in some transcendent sense would be controversial. But one problem today is that many people who would like to be spiritually inclined find that they're a spiritual wasteland, at least a lot of the time, whereas there is no medico-genetic reason why one can't engineer, in a sense, super spiritual beings. Now, I stress this isn't specifically what I urge or anything. It's just that, the option of enhanced spirituality is going to be available. I mean, it's not a simplistic case of there being a God gene, to use one example of a book of that title, but nonetheless, it's going to be possible to map out spiritual experience in the CNS and then choose either to abolish or enrich it.
What is the role of virtual reality and augmented reality in all of this?
One thing that virtual reality can't do is recalibrate the hedonic treadmill, and that someone with a very low hedonic set point is going to still have a low hedonic set point, even in a world of immersive, mature, cross-modally matched virtual reality. So you could be emperor of the cosmos, have a harem, all the kind of things you've dreamed of, and it can be super real. And yet, if you've got a depressive temperament, you'll still be depressive. That said,
And that's what we are,
it's
I'm sorry, that's what we are experiencing right now with respect to virtual worlds that we are interacting with
well,
online, right?
if well, no, what I would say is right now each of us lives. I'm not a direct realist about perception. I think that each of us lives in a organic virtual reality. With synthetic virtual realities, it would be possible to apparently suspend the laws of physics and give everyone the chance to live in a designer paradise. But unless we're prepared to re-engineer our reward circuitry, the hedonic treadmill will still grind. And it's can be counterintuitive. A lot of people think if only I had X, Y, or Z, then I would be happy. But yeah, the negative feedback mechanisms of the hedonic treadmill are extremely powerful. They've been extremely adaptive. It's fitness enhancing to be discontented, jealous, envious, you name it, a lot of the time, and at least in the ancestral environment. And so a predisposition to states of discontent, has been adaptive and exists to this day.
Yeah, I mean, we have evolved the way we have because of the necessities of our history, right? And I think one of the greatest pitches in favor of transhumanism is that just look around you and judge whether or not you can reach somewhere good and positive, big picture wise speaking, by depending on biological evolution. I don't think so. It just doesn't look like it.
Yeah, people have this sense of the natural and the unnatural, and they would include natural their iPhone and wearing clothes, and perhaps unnatural some transhumanist technologies. But this is very much of the function of the time and place where one is born.
I think at this point, about a year and a half ago, the first designer babies were born in Hong Kong or China.
In China, yeah.
And then that scientist got punished, and it seemed like it was something that they rather to keep, secret, and then it just came out. Some people make the same argument about this virus, but how far do you think we are from genetically modifying our babies and do it in a mainstream kind of a way? And what kind of steps we need to take, not only scientifically, but also mentally, to prepare ourselves to that day, which I think it's inevitable. It's coming, and it's coming much faster.
Yes, I mean,
it seems like it.
It's coming. This is every kid born today is a unique, untested genetic experiment, and that kid, in the course of a lifetime, is going to go through an awful lot of suffering as well as hopefully some joy. And I regard it as ethically problematic bringing new life and suffering into the world. But most people are natalists. They do think it's ethically permissible, indeed in many cases obligatory if they can, to have children. And if you do intend to have children, I think you have an obligation to load the genetic dice in your children's favor. And already one could, in principle, choose such things as the pain tolerance of your future child, ranging from a child with no pain sensitivity at all, which would cause all kinds of problems, but to having extremely high or low pain sensitivity, something like the SCN9A gene, which I can focus on, has dozens of different alleles with high or low pain sensitivity. Now, should one just throw the genetic dice and hope for the best, or should one choose the pain threshold of one's child? Now, in the case of something like predisposition to mental pain and distress, or hedonic set points, one can't point to a single gene, critical gene, in the same way. But nonetheless, we already know that particular alleles and allelic combinations are associated with having high hedonic set point, temperamental optimism. And I think prospective parents have an obligation when it becomes possible to actually choose the best for their future children. Now, in the case of the Chinese case you touched on, yes, we still don't know the full details, although allegedly he was, well, no, he was, the children in question will be apparently protected from HIV. The particular genetic alteration chosen in so-called animal models also is associated with superior cognition memory. And almost certainly he was really trying to produce ultra-intelligent, smart babies with HIV as a cover. I shouldn't say almost certainly, but I'm extremely skeptical that it was naivete. It wasn't just... other scientists, including Western scientists, I believe, were actually probably in the know here. Now, initially, the work was acclaimed, but then a lot of scientists, members of the public, morally hyperventilated, and yes, the scientist in question was hidden from view and disgraced. But yeah, I mean, a revolution is coming. I very much hope it will primarily focus ethically on subjective well-being. And although, yes, it would be fantastic if we can create smarter babies, intelligence is much, much more complex than pain sensitivity or even emotional well-being. And one possible thing that will happen if prospective parents routinely choose alleles for high IQs is that not merely the IQ of babies worldwide, but also the AQ will increase to AQ for autism or Asperger's quotient. Now, although many people would agree that other things being equal, it's good for kids to be intelligent. It's unclear what level of what AQ level is optimal, both for the individual or society as a whole. In that having an autistic cognitive style has both benefits and disadvantages. It's not a case of being straightforwardly bad or good, but it can be associated, for example, with mentalizing deficits. And transhumanism at its best argues for full spectrum superintelligence, which involves not merely massive amplification of the so-called autistic intelligence of the kind that's measured by IQ tests, but will also amplify capacity for social cognition, introspection, traits that simply aren't measured on conventional IQ tests at all. So, yeah, getting back to your original question, it's not simply a case of prospective parents being offered a kind of dial, choose the IQ of your child.
But there are also the matter of regulating it and the matter of detecting and determining that best that you're talking about. That at some point, obviously, AI is going to do a much better job of detecting what areas need to be altered and what kind of alteration needs to be done. And then the question will become, well, who's in charge of basically designing this baby? You know, I'm just doing this mental thing because all of this will be, you know, right in front of everybody's faces.
Yes, I mean, in the West, we tend to assume it will be done by prospective parents, quite probably with the guidance of medical professionals, but guidance. But there are other countries, perhaps China, in which a more due east approach is easy to conceive. And yeah, I mean, there are countless pitfalls and things could go wrong, but I mean, the point is that most people are not antinatalists. Most people are determined to have kids. So, yeah, it's so rather than asking, is it okay to morally permissible to conduct these genetic experiments? And the genetic experiments are the given. It's just is there some way to minimize the risk, to mitigate the harm? And yeah, I do believe that children born into the world today, in some sense, are harmed, and that they are likely, in the course of their lives, to undergo all manner of terrible experiences.
I don't think it's a question of whether or not it's morally permissible or should be permissible, because it's driven by technology. Like abortion right now, that the divide that exists because of abortion it's not going to go away, because one side believes that you're basically killing a living being and the other side believes that no, it's perfectly fine. But regardless of that, because the technology has become excuse me, more and more available, abortions can be done underground regardless of the legal kind of a status of it. So the same thing with respect to genetically editing your child. It's the matter of morality, when the morality is determined by some kind of a government or some kind of a regulator, right? But what is stopping people from experimenting underground and just, like, we just want to design a baby that has 350 IQ, even though the permissible limit is 200, for example?
Yes, I'm personally an IQ skeptic, but certainly as tools more with a kind of friendlier user interface become available, and one or two high-profile cases gain media attention, eventually, yeah, I think there is going to be a reproductive revolution, and it will be, yes, the socially acceptable thing to do to actually design your own child. Indeed, not doing so may be regarded as extremely irresponsible, as we now would say about Jehovah's Witnesses who don't allow their kid a life-saving blood transfusion and so forth. Yeah, I mean, huge ethical issues here. I don't know how it's going to play out, but on a slightly brighter note, I am confident that in the long run, because the nature of selection pressure will change, and most parents, almost all parents, do want to have happy children, if only because happy children tend to be successful, they're more fun to raise. I'm hopeful that hedonic set points, hedonic range, will be ratcheted upwards, that just as the cystic fibrosis gene, which has hundreds of different alleles, that's likely to disappear, there will be strong selection pressure against it. Likewise, I'm cautiously optimistic that there will be selection pressure against some of our nastier alleles and allelic combinations that were adaptive in the ancestral environment, but won't be in the new reproductive era of designer babies.
To reach that objective, would that require transhumanism for humans only as species, or also the human environment, which includes basically quote unquote nature? I consider everything to be nature, but the nature that we're talking about, because there will be effects, right? If you're behaving differently, our environment will behave differently with us and because of us.
Yes, one of perhaps the biggest moral revolution that I anticipate this century is our treatment of non-human animals, and I think it'll come in tandem with the cultured meat revolution. And so I would anticipate later this century, factory farms and slaughterhouses will be shut. And what then? What about the appalling suffering and the rest of the living world? And although here I am much more hesitant about timescales, a combination of CRISPR genome editing and the use of tunable synthetic gene drives that cheat the laws of Mendelian inheritance will actually allow us to reprogram the rest of nature and the living world too. The level of suffering of the living world is increasingly going to become an adjustable parameter. Now, to what extent later this century, next century and beyond, transhumans, eventually posthumans, will want to conserve traditional Darwinian life forms, I don't know. I personally think essentially Darwinian life is best transcended, but most people are pretty aghast at the thought that there won't be any lions or tigers. So yeah, it'll be possible to tweak lions and tigers so that they don't asphyxiate or disembowel or terrorize their victims, and yeah, essentially to civilize nature too.
Yeah, we just don't know what's coming.
Yeah, essentially.
Right.
I like many people, I didn't predict, COVID. I
Right.
didn't predict President Trump, and so on. And goodness knows what surprises lie in store. Yeah.
Yeah, quite a decade ahead, that's for sure.
Yes.
Hey, what is your thought on automation and UBI, Universal Basic Income?
Yeah. No. Essentially, yeah, I'm in favor of universal basic income. It's a kind of precondition of a civilized society. Although I talk a lot about the hedonic treadmill and how wealth per se won't make you rich, nonetheless, if you don't literally have enough to eat or pay the rent or the mortgage or support your kids, you're going to be unhappy. So yeah, I think COVID is likely to accelerate the movement towards universal basic income. We're already seeing anticipations of it in parts of the not really the Western world, even maybe in the USA. So yeah, I think it ought to transcend any kind of left-right dichotomy. Essentially, universal basic income, healthcare that is free in the point of delivery, and guaranteed access to accommodation. And although some transhumanists transcend any left-right label altogether. Others might crudely be called the libertarian right or left liberal. But something like universal basic income, for example, I just think should be a given, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum as conventionally defined.
Yeah, guaranteed accommodation. You're talking about housing.
Yes. I mean, this is it. It is absurd and immoral that there are people living on the streets. And given human nature as it exists today, then it's not as though one can be promising wonderful homes with all the latest mod cons and design for everyone. But basically, no one should have to sleep on the streets. And
I'll tell you this, there's a very good solution for that here in the United States. I don't know why people are not doing it, because there are so much land here in the US in the middle of nowhere. And you can get maybe like 100 acres, let's say. You can get it for $60,000, $70,000. Why not getting huge amount of lands and allow companies who are experimenting with like making shipping containers into small houses or 3D print houses, and allow these people to have their own, because a lot of them, they don't, they also have some kind of mental problem. A lot of them have addiction, people who live on the streets. And it just seems like you don't have to be in downtown San Francisco and then start demanding that you live in apartments in downtown San Francisco and start pissing everybody off. You can also live, and as you just said, you don't need much. You need, like a roof above your head, a little to eat, and some kind of a security, and that is completely doable, and not for that much money. I just don't understand why people are not doing it, even privately.
Yeah, I think it's coming, though. The actual political mechanics, I don't know. This is it. There is a temptation. I mean, I could outline to you all the political, social ways I would improve the world, and for the most part, it would just be more words. I don't hold the levers of political power, but as well as the hardcore technical stuff, we've got to guarantee people's basic living conditions. Everyone deserves an income. Yeah.
All right, David. What is next for you, and where can our audience follow your work?
Well, back in 1995, I wrote the Hedonistic Imperative, essentially, it's manifesto calling for the use of biotech to get rid of suffering throughout the living world. And headweb.com, HEDWEB.com, headweb.com. And though the web design is still somewhat dated, I try to update the site as often as I can. And yeah, there's probably 500,000 odd words there if anyone wants to dig deeper, but skim brutally. Personally, yeah, I am a writer, not a doer. I mean, I wish I could, be a gifted organizer or movement builder or politico. I will, at least to the best of my ability, to continue to fly the flag for this particular conception of transhumanism and the abolitionist project for as long as I can. I'm on social media too: Twitter, Webmaster Dave; Facebook, the Hedonistic Imperative Facebook group. Do get it in contact if you have any queries or frustrated that I didn't tackle any topics or deal with any objections I should have done. Please do get in contact.
What triggered writing your manifesto in mid-90s? Was it any specific kind of event, or it was just the natural outcome of a process?
It's hard to recall, but through the 20th century, if you had unusual ideas, then essentially the chances are they would be unpublishable. You could go on sort of street corners and declaim them, or you could, use the so-called vanity press. But yeah, it didn't really occur to me essentially that it was going to be possible to reach a global audience. But then the World Wide Web, and it's hard now perhaps for people who've taken the internet, the web for granted, to recall just how exciting this was. And so, being introduced to this idea, it was possible to reach a global audience with no censor, to be able to write exactly what one wanted, however outrageously implausible and far-fetched, and that was quite intoxicating. So I wrote the Hedonistic Imperative back in 1995. Since then, I've continued to write many other themes too, but that's the core ethical theme, that we are living in the last century in which involuntary suffering is inevitable, and we really need and deserve a kind of it sounds grandiose, but 100-year plan, biological, genetic, as well as political, to defeat the biology of suffering. And as long as I feel I can usefully contribute, I'll be flying the flag for transhumanism so conceived.
Yeah, this seems to be it. This century seems to be it. Whether what you're talking about or reaching type 1 civilization in the Kardashev scale, someone like Michio Kaku would say this is the point that we whether gonna make it or we're gonna destroy ourselves. So exciting regardless of the outcome, I think.
Unfortunately, I would love to tell you, do a Ray Kurzweil on you. 2045, the world's last unpleasant experience. I do think this millennium, 50-50 chance you'll get the world's last experience below hedonic zero, last unpleasant experience, but probably not for a few centuries, which is frustrating. But one needs to outline a vision that's not merely technologically credible, but also sociologically realistic. And of course, a lot of people are still very bioconservative.
Yeah, totally agree. Let me ask you the last question I ask all my guests, that if you come across an intelligent alien from a different civilization, what would you say is the worst thing humanity has done? And what would you say is their greatest achievement?
I think the worst thing that humans have done is to create factory farms and slaughterhouses. The pig, for example, is as sentient and, for what it's worth, demonstrably as sapient as a small child, and yet we routinely treat non-humans in ways that if we treated a human child in the same way, we'd get the perpetrator locked up for life. So yes, it is a monumental crime against sentience, the way we treat members of other species. What is the greatest thing humanity can do? Well, we are the only species that is intellectually capable of getting rid of all the pain, suffering, misery, heartache in the world. No other species can do this. And if for no other reason, I hope that humans survive for long enough so that, yes, we can get rid of not really suffering in humans, but also reprogram the biosphere and create a happy tree of life.